All right, welcome back. Sebastian here. Time for my power rankings for the 2025 Miami Grand Prix. Thought fairly, interesting Grand Prix weekend. Good racing in the sprint, good racing in the Grand Prix itself. Some pretty tight, intense qualifying sessions as well. So I think all in all, one of the better races this season. So quite a few things for us to talk about for my power rankings for this race. So starting out number 20, I think there were quite a few drivers who definitely, had weaker races. And wasn't really one driver who I thought was, absolutely the worst. Definitively the worst driver this weekend. But, unfortunately, the way that I do these power rankings from 1 to 20, someone has to be ranked last. And today that is going to be one Mr. Liam Lawson. So for Lawson, qualifies 14th in sprint qualifying, out qualified by his teammate Hadjar. In the sprint, finishes 13th, gets a 10-second, I believe 10-second penalty. It could have been a 5. I don't remember which of the two it was, but basically gets a penalty for spinning Alonso around towards the end of the sprint at turn 11. I think in that move, it was, important. I think the penalty was a little bit harsh, but I do think for Lawson in that situation, he probably should have backed out in the corner before he, basically spun Alonso around, and that would have avoided the penalty. Probably doesn't get the overtake made there, but again, stays one position outside the points, and based on what would happen a little bit later on, he would have eventually gotten that point anyway without that move. Main race, qualifies 15th, out qualified by his teammate by about 3.5 tenths of a second. Apparently had some kind of ERS battery issue during qualifying, which could have affected his pace. It's the second time in the last 3 races that he's had some kind of technical issue, or supposedly had some kind of technical issue in qualifying, so a bit unfortunate there. And then the main Grand Prix, has a decent start, but unfortunately contact with Doohan heavily compromises his race, spins him around at the first corner, and he ends up retiring there. Stewards label that crash basically a racing incident, which meant that in theory both drivers have to take a little bit of blame for that. And all in all, a pretty unfortunate weekend for Lawson. Now, number 19, I'm going to go with Oliver Behrman. So for Behrman, qualifying a big issue this weekend, and something that's been very, very strange at Haas. Pretty much every weekend that we've had so far this season, at least one driver has struggled mightily in qualifying, and it alternates back and forth which of the two it is, and this weekend it was Behrman. So for Behrman, qualifies 19th in sprint qualifying. Obviously, the holdup at the pit lane where I think 4 to 5 drivers basically couldn't set a time at the end of the session, that definitely, contributed to that. He comes back, actually would have finished in the points, but unfortunately got a penalty, I believe, for basically in a pit infringement, basically came out for an unsafe release. So again, unfortunate there, which then dropped him back to 14th. In the main race, qualified 19th in, again, without those same shenanigans, but still not a great qualifying result. Qualified by Ocon by 5.5 tenths a second, so a gap that's definitely much bigger than you would like. And then in the end, I think pretty quiet race from him, and then eventually retired with some kind of power unit issue. Number 18 is Jack Doohan, and I hope for Jack Doohan's sake that this is not the last time he ends up in my power rankings. There's been some noise last couple of days about Alpine potentially making a switch, and we'll see in the 2 weeks from now and Imola if that switch does come to pass or not. Unfortunately for Doohan, his F1 career has basically been at risk before it even got going. So we'll see if that comes to a head in the next couple weeks, or if we'll see if that leash is extended a little bit further. But for doing sprint qualifying, qualified 17th, again caught him in the same kind of kerfuffle that I mentioned earlier with Behrman. Finishes 16th in the sprint, not a great result there. In qualifying, finishes main qualifying, qualifies 14th, actually out-qualifies Gasly for the first time this season, so decent result for in qualifying, and I think that's really what's keeping Doohan off the bat from basically being last this week again. But unfortunately for him, that all that good work in qualifying, getting himself into Q2 is all undone at that first corner. I think a little bit too ambitious from Doohan, trying to basically stick a move up the inside of what's a pretty tight corner, especially when you're in the midfield. And that basically just ended his race, contact puncture, and he basically couldn't even get around back to the pits after that. So I think really unfortunate Grand Prix for him. Number 17 is Yuki Tsunoda. Now for Tsunoda, I think one lap pace is again continuing to be an issue, and I think it's something that's holding Tsunoda back quite a bit this season, and it's, I think, really difficult to understand. I mean, I don't think we really understand exactly why Red Bull's second seat seems to have a massive issue in qualifying. It happened with Loss in the first 2 races. It happened again all 4 races, I believe, that Tsunoda's done. In fact, the closest that driver's gotten to Max Verstappen in a main qualifying session has been half a second, which is generally not what you want to see. So, again, something that we'll see if it improves in the coming races. So for Tsunoda, basically knocked out in Q1 for sprint qualifying. Shouldn't have put himself in that situation. Should have been able to get through to SQ2 in that with a single run, but not able to do so. Really good sprint though. Moved his way up into 6, some good points there, and that again similar to doing a really good result in one part of the weekend. I think really making sure that he's not at the very back of this power ranking. So again, does get some credit for that result in the sprint, but again, helped massively by some of the situations, some of the things that happened in the sprint. Main qualifying, qualifies 10th, at least gets himself into Q3, but out-qualified by about 7/10 of a second, and his teammate was on pole. So, realistically, he should have been qualifying inside the top 5, top 6. And then in the race, a bit of a quiet race, picks up a 5-second penalty, a bit sloppy there. For speeding in the pit lane, and comes home in 10th. So penalty in the end of the day doesn't end up affecting his finishing position in the end, but still not a great weekend, I would say, for Tsunoda. So now we're into the second row, and coming in at number 16, I'm going to go with Gabriel Bortoleto. So for Bortoleto, sprint portion of the weekend, not so great. Qualifies 18th, finishes 15th in the sprint. Pretty quiet there. Main Grand Prix, out-qualifies his teammate Hulkenberg, so decent result there. Out-qualifies Hulkenberg by 1.3 tenths of a second. But then in the race, really early pit stop on those onto the hard tires. Don't think he would have finished in the points anyway, but I think he could have finished in the top 14, top 13%, perhaps somewhere between 11th and 14th, I would say. But unfortunately, some kind of mechanical issue, and he's forced to retire from the race. But I think, some bright spots there for Bortoleto, and I think, again, his teammate Hulkenberg hasn't shown up yet, but I think, honestly, you very, very close in performance, the two of them, and I think, you could switch the two of them around if you thought that was appropriate, too. Number 15 is Pierre Gasly, the other Alpine driver. So for Gasly, sprint qualifying, qualifies 13th. Kind of takes advantage of some of the chaos in the sprint, picks up a single point in 8th, so again, decent result there. Main qualifying session, pretty poor from him. Qualifies 18th, out-qualified by his teammate Doohan by almost 0.3 of a second. And then in the race, starting in the pit lane, comes back to 13th, which I think, given the pace of the Alpine, most races, I think that's a pretty reasonable result. But again, I think he will be kicking himself a bit for the poor qualifying session and, having such a big gap to Doohan. Number 14, I am going with Bortoleto's teammate Nico Hulkenberg here. So for Hulkenberg, sprint portion of the weekend I thought was very good, and that's, I think, the peaks that he had there, I think, is kind of, in my mind, is what's keeping him, ahead of Bortoleto. But again, this is one of the things where of having, a weekend where it's not just qualifying main Grand Prix, but you also have the sprint portion to consider as well. And of course, sprint not as important as the main Grand Prix, but still, it does, contribute in my books to, where I put drivers in my power rankings. So qualifies 11th, so close to getting a point in the sprint, finishes the sprint in 9th. Things a little bit different, maybe, a driver who finished in the points has a bad strategy. Perhaps Hulkenberg gets a point. That would have been, a very, very different story. Main qualifying, not so good. Qualifies 16th. Out-qualified by Bortoleto, like I mentioned before. But in the race, I think, pretty quiet race, but solidly comes home to a 14th place finish. Now, number 12, actually I'm going to do these two together. Number 12, number 13 are your two Aston Martin drivers. So for Alonso, sprint qualifying, qualifies 10th. And then the sprint looks to be on his first points of the season. Fortunately tagged by Lawson. I don't think Alonso could have done a whole lot more in that situation. Maybe give, Lawson a little bit of room on the outside of that corner. But I think, a really unfortunate situation for Alonso. Right on the cusp of scoring his first points of the year, he gets tagged in the wall. His teammate picks up points, he doesn't. So depending on how things shake up for the rest of the season, I think the points head-to-head between Alonso and Stroll could be very, very unrepresentative. Now for Stroll in the sprint, qualifies 16th. Really good strategy, moves him up the order quite a bit. I think, a similar strategy to what Hamilton did, pitted, a little bit early. And that's another thing to mention. Alonso kind of got screwed over by his team. I get that they're being, very conservative. They don't want to throw a points, finish away, but probably should have pitted Alonso a little bit earlier. But for Stroll, really good strategy. Comes home, benefits from a whole bunch of other drivers getting penalties. I think 4 drivers who finished ahead of him got penalties, so he finishes in 5th somehow in the sprint. Picks up, I think, 4 points there. So good result there for him. Main Grand Prix, 2 Astons finish 17, qualify 17th and 18th. Alonso 2 and a bit tenths ahead of Stroll. So again, not a massive gap there. I did think Alonso was generally the better of the 2 drivers all weekend. So that's why I have Alonso ahead of Stroll, despite Stroll, of course, being the one to pick up the points. In the main Grand Prix, Alonso, really uncharacteristic spin, and I think that really, for me, just the sloppiness of that kind of stops him from being any higher on my power rankings. Otherwise, he could have been maybe 10th, maybe 9th. But unfortunately, the Aston Martin had such awful pace. I think they finished 17 seconds off of Hulkenberg in the end. The 2 of them finished very, very close together, so it's not like Stroll had, bad race pace or anything. I think, Stroll had a pretty reasonable weekend, all things considered, and that's why he's 13th and ahead of quite a few other drivers, actually. So, moving on from the 2 Aston Martins, we're going to move into 11th, where I've put Isaac Hadjar. So, for Hadjar, no points this weekend, but I think, a pretty solid weekend for him at a track, again, he does not know, much like all the other rookies this season. So, sprint qualifying, qualifies 9th, gets himself into the top 10, finishes 10th. I think a little bit unfortunate not to maybe capitalize a bit more on the tricky conditions. Other drivers in the midfield like Stroll picked up quite a few points in the sprint, and again, I think Racing Bulls probably had quite a much better car than the Aston Martin. But nonetheless, main qualifying session, qualifies 11th. I think decent result there, getting about where you would expect the Racing Bulls to qualify. And then the main race finishes in 11th, very, very close to getting Tsunoda for that final points position, but not quite within that 5-second buffer that he needed to be in. Now, moving into the top 10, number 10, I'm going to go with Esteban Ocon. So despite the fact that it was a pointless weekend for Ocon, I thought the Haas car not particularly strong this weekend. And I think, Ocon did, a really solid job overall. So qualifies 12th for the sprint, finishes the sprint in 12th, and then the main Grand Prix portion of the weekend qualifies 9th, gets himself into Q3. So good job there. Qualifies Behrman by about 5.5 tenths, like I said before. And then the main Grand Prix finishes in 12th. So I think all in all, pretty solid weekend for Ocon. So now moving into the 9th, I am going to go with Carlos Sainz. So I think another unfortunate, tricky weekend for Sainz. I think obviously at points he was, very, very good. At other points, not so good. So for Sainz, qualifies 15th for sprint qualifying, and then ends up with a puncture, a bit of a mistake. I think taps the wall at one point during the sprint when in those tricky conditions. And unfortunately, ends up retiring there. Main qualifying session, I think easily his best session of the weekend. Qualifies in 6th, out-qualifies his teammate Albon by about a tenth of a second. At points, looked like he could have been on for a really, really good result. It seems like he picked up damage early on, contact with Albon, trying to avoid Norris's maneuver in turn 2 or turn 3. And that, I think, unfortunately cost him quite a bit of performance, but nonetheless comes home to a 9th place finish. So I think, a decent result, but some of those mistakes, especially in the sprint, I think do hold him back a little bit in my power rankings. Now, number 8, I'm going to go with Lewis Hamilton. So for Hamilton, qualifies 7th in the sprint. And again, not a particularly amazing qualifying session for either Ferraris, I should say, but a really, really good strategy. In the sprint, moves him up into 3rd. So really good sprint, I would say, in terms of results in the end. For the main race session, knocked out in Q2, so not great there, but given how bad the pace was for the Ferrari this weekend, again, I don't think it's the end of the world. He's only out-qualified by Leclerc by 0.05 of a second. So again, not a big gap there. I know there was massive, kerfuffle on the radio between the two, Hamilton, his engineer, Leclerc, his engineer, about what they were doing. I think the race pace for Hamilton was strong, and I don't think anything better than 7th was really possible, but still, I think again, a little bit of a strong recovery drive for Hamilton. So I think 8th in my power rankings, and yeah, finished 8th in the Grand Prix. Now, number 7 is his teammate Leclerc. So for Leclerc, sprint portion not so particularly strong. Unfortunately, crashes on the formation lap of the sprint, takes him out of that race. So again, that really holds Leclerc back quite a bit. Otherwise, I think he would have been definitely in the top row. But for Leclerc, qualified 8th, out-qualified his teammate Hamilton by 500s, like I said, and then pretty quiet Grand Prix in terms of in terms of battling other teams. Not so quiet in terms of radio, that's for sure. But again, comes home for 7th. I think a decent weekend overall for Leclerc. So moving into the top row, at number 6, I'm going to go with George Russell. For Russell, I think the one downside for Russell, I would say, is that this was kind of the first weekend all season where we kind of seemed a bit off the pace, just in terms of outright performance. Out-qualified by his teammate Antonelli in both the sprint qualifying and main qualifying sessions. Qualified 5th in the sprint, and then comes home to 4th place finish. So again, solid result there. In this main qualifying, again, qualified 5th, out-qualified by his teammate by about a 10th. Gets on the podium. Quite fortunate with the strategies, going on the alternative strategy, starting on the hards, going to mediums, pits during the virtual safety car, gets ahead of Verstappen. Really epitomizes the do nothing gets P3 meme that's been circulating around the internet. But again, I think the result was good. I think how he gets that result is maybe not, he won't be super happy with that, but I still think it was a decent weekend for Russell. Now, number 5 is his teammate Antonelli, who I think had probably his most competitive weekend of the season. Gets on pole for the sprint qualifying, absolutely mega result there. Really unfortunate with the basically being forced to take a drive-through penalty in the sprint because of Verstappen's mechanics, sending Verstappen out in front of Antonelli and basically doesn't let him pit. So his sprint gets ruined there, recovers to a 7th place finish, but again, I think without that, he probably finishes 2nd or 3rd. Again, start wasn't amazing, makes a bit of a mistake at turn 1. I think obviously things that you would expect from a rookie, but still outright performance, very, very good this weekend. Main race, qualifies 3rd, takes advantage of the start, moves up to 2nd, but again, the pace not quite there. And I think a little bit unfortunate with the VSC timing to end up behind his teammate. And again, I do think the outright pace was lacking a little bit in terms of race pace and such, which is why he's not a little bit higher up. But still, I think, in terms of performance, I think a very, very competitive weekend from Antonelli. And yeah, just to close off, he comes home to finish the race in 3rd. Now, moving into the top 4, number 4, I'm going to go with Lando Norris. So for Norris, a good weekend. I think better than some of the ones he's had recently, but I still think there's room for improvement there. So for Norris, qualifies in the sprint in 3rd. Really benefits from the late virtual safety car caused by the Alonso. I think it's I can't remember if it was the Sainz one or the Alonso one, but one of the two. Basically, virtual safety car comes out, and he basically pits for dry tires, comes out in front of Piastri, despite Piastri being in front before. So a little bit lucky there, but again, performance a little bit lacking compared to Piastri in those conditions. Then we get to the main race, qualifying good, qualify 2nd, probably should have gone pole, but again, that's something that can be leveled at both McLaren drivers. This time out qualifies Piastri by about 10, so that's good there. And then in the race, a bit of a high risk move at turn 1, or at turn 2, I should say, trying to overtake Verstappen. I think, and like I said in my review this morning, I do think that move potentially costs him the win. In the end, it drops him quite a few positions back, and it basically gives Piastri a pretty big buffer that he can basically just control throughout the whole race. But I think, the race pace there was pretty good for Norris. I do think this was, a much cleaner weekend overall than some of the ones he's had recently, like Bahrain or Jeddah. Now, number 3, I'm going to go with Alex Albon. So for Albon, qualifies 8th in the sprint. Would have finished qualified 8th for the sprint. In the sprint, would have finished 5th. Got a penalty, I think, for driving too slow behind the safety car. So that's an interesting one. And then that penalty drops him to 11th. So a bit unfortunate there. Main qualifies 7th. Again, a little bit of ultimate pace there that was lacking. Otherwise, he could have been maybe 1st or 2nd in my power rankings. But really, really strong pace in the race. Comes home for a 5th place finish. on merit, finishes ahead of a Mercedes, both Ferraris and a Red Bull. Very, very good job by Albon there. I think, probably arguably one of his best weekends at Williams. And, I think for Williams in terms of pace, probably one of their best weekends in the last 10 years, just from a pure pace perspective. Now, coming into the top two, let's go through this. So number 2, I'm going to go with race winner Oscar Piastri. And number 1, I'm going to go with Max Verstappen, who doesn't even end up on the podium for all of his good work that he put in this weekend. So for Piastri, I think for me, the one thing kind of holding him back was I think he didn't have a perfect weekend. I do think he was a little bit fortunate with some of the things that happened, and his car was obviously very, very quick. But that being said, I still think he had a very, very good weekend. So let's get into this. So for Piastri, sprint qualified second. Again, pretty good job there. A little bit unlucky not to win the sprint. I thought sprint was, pretty good. Main qualifying session qualifies 4th. Again, I think, like I said with Norris, I think there was a little bit more there in terms of one-lap performance for the McLaren. But opportunistic, takes advantage of Norris's error, kind of being too aggressive at turn 2, and then very, very clinical, overtakes Antonelli, overtakes Verstappen, controls the pace of the race very, very well. So I think overall, very good weekend by Piastri. But I think in terms of just performance, I do think Max Verstappen was a little bit better. So for Verstappen, qualifies 4th for the sprint, which I think realistically is where he should have been. I think you can make an argument that maybe, one lap pace between himself and the Mercedes, maybe they're about equal. And given that Antonelli was on pole, but on the other hand, should a rookie Antonelli be out qualifying Max Verstappen? Probably not. I think it's also, a pretty fair answer. Now, in the sprint, I think he was doing a pretty reasonable job, basically in 3rd place where he should have been. And his pit crew decided, we don't want to score any points today. And they basically have probably one of the worst unsafe releases I've seen in the last 10 years or so. And that basically gives a very rightfully deserved 10-second penalty. Now, unfortunately for Verstappen, the race ends under a safety car. And just like Carlos Sainz, I believe, at the Australian Grand Prix, I believe 2 years ago, where Sainz basically has a penalty and the race finishes under a safety car, that penalty basically dropped him way further down the order than I think the penalty kind of justified, right? Verstappen basically got disqualified, or like a drive-through penalty equivalent, even though it was only a 10-second penalty. So again, quite unfortunate there for Verstappen, not his mistake whatsoever. And then main qualifying session, takes pole position, probably when he shouldn't have. Again, McLaren's probably should have had a 1-2 in qualifying. Excellent job in qualifying there, full marks there. In the race, again, locks up at turn 1, but somehow keeps it ahead of Norris. And I think, did an excellent job defending from the 2 McLarens as long as he could. And then, unfortunately, again, more bad luck with the virtual safety car, loses position to Russell, and comes home for a 4th place finish. So I think a little bit of an unlucky weekend for Verstappen on a weekend where he performed very, very well. And I think, for the championship, it's 32 points, I think, is the gap for Verstappen. I think probably he's going to need a lot of help if he wants to win the title this year. The good news for him, though, is that we are heading to Europe, and the European tracks are generally ones where Verstappen is very, very strong. Generally, though, that's his kind of strongest part of the season, stronger than, the races we've just had, and stronger than the ones towards the end of the season. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But there you go. That is my power rankings for the 2025 Miami Grand Prix. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.